that I'm not able to join you all in person, but these are strange and interesting times, so we'll make do the best we can. Hopefully we won't have any technical problems or anything. If you do have any trouble, let us know, and hopefully we can take care of that. So my basic idea today was to build out a couple of ideas from the book, but not to really try to do an overview or anything, but to really think about how thinking carefully about the politics of memory can actually help us to understand contemporary political events, and to really give us a different perspective on some of the disagreements and political problems that we see in the EU today. So you've already heard a little bit about the book. I'm dropping a link to the landing page, which is about 2 days old, of the press into the little chat area, just in case anybody's interested in seeing the cover or what it looks like. But my idea today is really not to overview the book, but to really try to take some basic insights from the book and apply them to what's happening today. The other thing is I'll just be speaking. I've decided against using any slides or anything like that, even though I know that I can do so through the Blackboard site. And I realized that that may be a somewhat strange decision, and that PowerPoint is very popular. However, there's a lot of really good research now on PowerPoint, and that research shows that while it's good for helping students to learn factual information, it actually makes students into more passive learners, and it actually makes them less critical of the material presented. So I want you to be critical, and I don't think that I'll actually be giving you all that much more factual information today. Really, I want to give you a different perspective and a different way of thinking about things. So I really want that your critical thinking to be engaged. Hence the sort of more kind of Luddite approach to this of not having any slides and just talking to you. Hopefully that will work. So with that said as an introduction, I will jump into my argument, and I'm calling the talk for today, Europe Caught Between 1945 and 1989, Memory and Differing Understandings of Democracy in Western and Central Europe. The revolutions of 1989 and the subsequent fall of communism seemingly signaled the victory of liberal democratic capitalism, after most of Central and Eastern Europe had been stranded behind the Iron Curtain for half a century. This region, which Milan Kundera famously referred to as the kidnapped West, abducted as it was from its Western European heritage by the Red Army at the end of World War II, quickly adopted political, legal, and economic reforms based on the Western liberal democratic model. In confirmation of the apparent success of these measures, a mere 15 years later, the first post-communist states were celebrating their accession to the EU. As of the 1st of May 2004, the reunification of Europe seemed complete. Another 15 years later, from the vantage point of 2020, this narrative seems hopelessly naive and Panglossian. Instead of reflecting further political integration and economic convergence, 30 years after 1989, 31 I suppose we're coming up on now, Europe is seemingly divided once more. This is particularly visible in a number of political divisions that run along the Iron Curtain. In my talk today, I want to focus on one particularly important problem or aspect of these divisions, the issue of democracy. More specifically, I will argue that the states on either side of this symbolic barrier are operating with different understandings of democracy, as well as with the role and value of the nation state within contemporary democratic politics. In contrast to the post-system of liberal democracy established in the West, which protects individual and minority rights and generally privileges the rule of law over national sovereignty, the states of post-communist Europe have developed their own version of illiberal democracy, as I'm sure most of you have heard. This notion of illiberal democracy emphasizes the popular sovereignty of the nation over external claims to protection based on universal human rights, legal procedure, and international law. Although illiberal nationalist parties and movements have gained support in Western European states as well, they've only actually taken power and consolidated their regimes in the post-communist region. led by Viktor Orban's Fidesz and Jarosław Kaczyński's Prawo i Sprawiedliwość parties, a new axis of liberalism has formed around the Visegrad Group, composed of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia, formerly the Czech Republic. And if you want to talk about this later in Q&A, we can, but I fear that Slovenia, where I'm from, is going down this same path as well. While these regimes have worked hard to avoid evoking images familiar from 20th century dictatorships by maintaining the electoral trappings of democratic legitimacy, they have secured their rule through gerrymandering, the manipulation of electoral rules, the neutering of the judiciary, and the takeover of the media by friendly tycoons. This approach to democracy, which stresses the general will of the Republican majority over the liberal protection of rights, is the mirror image to that of the western half of the continent, which seeks to ensure that human and minority rights cannot be undermined by majority vote. These differing understandings of democracy and of the nation state pose an important puzzle for our understanding of democratic consolidation. In order to understand these divisions, I argue that we need to pay attention not only to economic and cultural factors, in other words, not only to the left behind and the losers of globalization, as much of the literature would have it, but also to the influence of memory cultures on contemporary politics. In particular, I argue that we need to pay attention to the fact that while the historic imaginary of Western Europe continues to be defined by the defeat of fascism in 1945, across Central and Eastern Europe, this is not the most important dividing line. On the contrary, in Central Europe, discourses in cultural memory are dominated instead by 1989. This is important because these divergent frameworks of collective memory bring strikingly different lessons to bear on the present. For Western Europeans, collective memories of 1945 serve as evidence that nationalism and the failure to protect individual rights is the primary danger to both peace and democracy. By contrast, for Central Europeans, 1989 represents a repudiation of external influence, in particular that external influence that was wielded by the Soviet Union and the domestic Communist Party, which is often seen as just a branch of Moscow's will, not of nationalism and national sovereignty. It therefore serves as the basis for resisting outside interference in what are perceived to be domestic affairs, including by the EU and other international actors. In the rest of my talk, I will build out on these basic ideas. First, I'll say a little bit more about collective memory and the role that key dates, such as 1945 and 1989, play in organizing societal frameworks of remembrance. Hopefully, this won't be too boring to those of you who have been talking about memory all semester long. I will then expand on the impact the differences between the prevailing memory cultures in Western and Central Europe, respectively, have on their understanding of democracy, and I'm using the example of the refugee crisis of 2015. I will conclude with some broader reflections on why social science and scholars of public policy should pay more attention to the impact of memory. So, the first section, a little bit of background on the politics of memory. So since the late 1970s, history and the humanities have experienced a so-called memory boom, which has led to an increase in the attention paid to the impact of the past on social life in the present. One of the key findings of this new research paradigm is that collective memory is crucial for societal integration. In most cases and at most times, the prevailing frameworks of societal memory serve a stabilizing function by helping individuals to organize their experience using shared markers of importance. So-called memory cultures thus typically act as a conservative force, stabilizing individual stories within established societal narratives. However, at certain moments in the history of a community, and I think the French Revolution of 1789 is probably the paradigmatic example of this, critical events break apart existing narratives, thus allowing shifts in the basic narrative frameworks of memory, in other words, shifts in memory cultures. These formative experiences, often represented by certain key symbolic dates, such as 1989, 1945, 1789, thus act as markers for these communal ruptures. In this sense, they define what both came before and what comes after, or redefine what comes before and what came after. In moments like these, political leaders and cultural elites are able to use their positions to act as memory entrepreneurs by providing their communities with new narratives and new frameworks of collective memory that make sense of these ruptures within using the past, but putting it together in new ways, in other words, by creating new narratives. These new narrative cultures do not just appear, nor are they immutable. On the contrary, they're open to abuse by leaders who are able to articulate them in ways that can then be taken up by the community as a whole. As a result, despite their grounding in actual events, the narratives that organize collective memory are not spontaneously generated. Instead, they are created and spread by individuals who act as what the social theorist Jeffrey Alexander calls collective agents of the trauma process, or so-called carrier groups. The differing frameworks of collective memory in Western and post-communist Europe, as well as the actions of leaders who interpret this past, help to explain the divergent understandings of democracy and the role of the nation state that I want to talk about. I'll briefly summarize these developments in the West before turning my attention to the differing narrative in Central Europe. So, in Western Europe, collective remembrance is generally shaped by the traumatic events of the Second World War, culminating in the victory over fascism in 1945. Immediately following the end of the war, key political leaders, including people like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi, etc., argued that rampant nationalism had led Europe into two world wars and the atrocities that had occurred as a result. These so-called agents of the trauma process concluded that the lack of protections for basic human rights enabled the persecution of Jews and other minorities throughout the continent, as well as the atrocities of the Holocaust. As a result, they argued that renouncing or pooling parts of their sovereignty within continental institutions outside of the constitutional infrastructure of the nation state was the only way to overcome the national antagonisms that had resulted in the persecution of minority groups and thus had led Europe into two world wars. This conclusion, which was shared by major political parties across Western Europe after the war, had important consequences for the development of post-war democracy. Although popular sovereignty was still important, the lessons of 1945 show that the will of the people could only function properly within what in political theory is called a constrained democracy, i.e. a democracy that protected individual and group rights from interference by domestic institutions. The post-war liberal democratic order in Western Europe thus sought to ensure that nation states could not deploy national law to kill the juridical person by taking away basic rights from wanted individuals, which was the first step in the administrative process that culminated in the Nazi gas chambers. And for those who are interested in learning more about sort of the importance of the killing of the juridical person and how that really enabled a lot of the atrocities of the Second World War, I would highly recommend a lot of Timothy Snyder's recent work, especially Bloodlands, which I think is a really wonderful book. So in addition to its effects on the development of democracy at the domestic level, which was characterized by the passage of bills of rights that were designed to protect basic individual and group rights from electoral deterioration, the lessons of 1945 also have important implications for the relationship between democracy and the nation state. The newfound fear of nationalism in Western Europe led to the development of the EU, which not only sought to make war unthinkable via greater political cooperation, but also materially impossible through the development of the common market and other economic measures of integration. The project of supranational rights protection had a legal dimension as well. The development of European law, which takes precedence over national law as a result of the doctrine of supremacy, is designed to protect human rights at the continental level. In addition to the EU, the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg seek to ensure the protection of human rights of persecuted individuals by giving them legal standing to report or even sue their host states for rights violations, regardless of citizenship and regardless of sort of the traditional inhibitions on standing before international courts. Thus, in addition to constraining popular sovereignty domestically, the lessons of 1945 resulted in a broader skepticism of the nation state as the appropriate sphere for democracy, at least on its own, as well as of its ability to protect the rights of all its residents, including non-nationals or non-citizens. These legal, constitutional, and political developments are rooted in the shared remembrance of the two world wars and of the Holocaust. In their speeches, writings, and other arguments in favor of these measures, politicians, writers, and other memory entrepreneurs in the West repeatedly emphasized that the imperative of developing new supranational forms of cooperation after the Second World War is rooted in the experience of total war and the atrocities that had engulfed all European nations in bloody conflicts. Over the course of the second half of the 20th century, this collective memory was disseminated through the development of countless memorials and other symbolic places designed to remind individuals of the lessons of 1945 and to teach them or pass on to the next generation. In this Western memory culture, the fear of another Auschwitz became the ultimate argument against any political relapse, to the point where it became possible to speak of what Tony Judt has called the Holocaust as the European entry ticket, the sine qua non of European identity from the perspective of the Western half of the continent. So that's the West. By contrast, collective memory cultures on the other side of the Iron Curtain developed very differently over the course of the post-war era. While 1945 is also an important symbolic date in Central Europe, in this region, 1945 is not a date of liberation. Instead, it stands for the transition from one form of totalitarian occupation to another, from Nazi to Soviet rule. Whereas the Western narrative emphasizes this idea of emancipation and learning from the past, the states of post-communist Europe experienced the end of the Second World War as a renewed occupation, resulting in the renewed loss of their national sovereignty. In contrast to the centrality of fascism and the Holocaust in the Western historical imaginary, the legacy of communism is the most defining phenomenon of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. As a result, in this region today, 1989 is the key date to understanding what comes before and after, not 1945. The centrality of 1989 in the collective memory cultures of the post-communist Europe has important consequences for the views of democracy and of the nation state in this region. Unlike in the West, where the specter of 1945 acts as a reminder of the dangers of denying individuals and minorities certain fundamental rights, the lessons of 1989 in Central Europe are less about rights protection and more about the importance of self-government and the repudiation of external interference in domestic affairs. This is not to say that the communist regimes in the East did not violate civic or political rights in their states. Of course they did. However, in post-communist Europe, these violations are associated with Soviet interventions in the internal affairs of its satellite states, represented most paradigmatically in the iconic photographs of Red Army tanks driving down the streets of Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968. As a result of this framework of collective memory, in Central Europe, communism is associated with national enslavement. The post-communist regions aimed in throwing off the yoke of communism and the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact was therefore not the liberal protection of human rights based on the equality of all citizens, but self-government, represented by their desire to exercise their will through majoritarian actions. This aspiration built on long-standing memories of empire, invasion, partition, and occupation by the West going back hundreds of years. This collective understanding of communism as a form of external control and as a violation of popular sovereignty also has important implications for Central European understandings of the nation state. The transitional democracies created in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall found the multicultural values of the EU to be at odds with the zeitgeist in their own domestic societies. In contrast to the multiculturalism and globalization promoted by the West, Central Europe after 1989 still held on to an older understanding of the nation rooted in the 19th century ideal of the Kulturnation, the cultural nation, defined by language, religion, and common historical background, which is then transposed onto politics. Given that communism itself is a global movement that operates independently of all nationality, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels famously argue in the Communist Manifesto, it is understandable that a backlash against its imposition from the outside would result in a renewed emphasis on popular sovereignty, but on national sovereignty in particular. In other words, on that nationalism that was prohibited for 45 years after the end of World War II. The fact that many of the nations of Central Europe achieved independence during the interwar period, and in some cases even under Nazi occupation, before they were folded into the Soviet sphere of influence in the aftermath of the Yalta Conference, only reinforces this trend, as they can look back fondly on a distinct democratic tradition of self-government at the national level. The fact that many of these Quisling regimes in the interwar years collaborated with the Nazis is forgotten or silenced in these narratives, which look back on these periods of pre-Cold War independence as precursors of post-1989 national sovereignty. Just as memory entrepreneurs in the West helped to shape the lessons of 1945 by emphasizing the liberal protection of rights and the importance of the universalistic over the particularistic nature of the nation, the post-communist narrative has also been disseminated and institutionalized by important carrier groups within these societies. Both Orban and Kaczynski have sought to emphasize the importance of the nation and of national sovereignty by creating narratives that focus on these areas. If we think about what Orban is doing, in his politics of memory, he focuses on the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, which gave large portions of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the neighboring states, including Romania and the Ukraine, as well as the newly formed Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia after World War I. This story of Western betrayal builds on the narrative propagated by the interwar leader of Hungary, Milos Horthy, who sought to legitimize his rule by blaming the Entente for these developments. It also serves to excuse Horthy's own dalliances with Hitler and Mussolini, since these were the road to the recovery of some of the territories lost after World War I. Today, the signing of the Treaty of Trianon and of Hungarian resistance more generally is memorialized on National Unity Day, which is celebrated every 4th of June. Orban's government has also passed a law offering Hungarian citizenship to Hungarian-speaking descendants of nationals who lived in the country before 1920. Orban has also sought to root Hungary's national identity deeply in the European history of Christianity, a historical imaginary that silences the period of communist rule entirely. The national avowal contained within Hungary's new constitution of April 2011 locates the nation's founding in the mythical actions of Saint Stephen and expresses pride in the fact that the Hungarian people has over centuries defended Europe in a series of struggles against Islam in the guise of the Ottoman Empire. The rooting of peoplehood in medieval history allows Orban to de-emphasize the recent past by presenting the revolutions of 1989 as a return to an older tradition of divinely ordained self-rule. He has even sought to replace recent history with myth by removing statues of Hungarians associated with communism, including the philosopher and opponent of Soviet Marxism, György Lukács, and the leader of the 1956 anti-Soviet uprising, Imre Nagy. These moves help to sediment the notion that communism was a foreign imposition that allow Orban to argue that the system of liberal democracy is just another attempt by foreign powers the EU and Western Europe in particular, to exert control over Hungary. Unlike the post-war era, when the Communist Party in Hungary was seen as nothing but a mechanism for executing the will of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and thus the will of Moscow, Orban's actions today allow him to argue that the Hungarian government is not subjected to control from the outside by anyone or anywhere. This is a very powerful argument for him, and it has allowed him to not only win some democratic elections, but to consolidate a democratic regime that does not even require victory in elections anymore. In other words, the narrative of liberation from external influence has really helped Orban to develop his own conception of Europe based on a decoupling of liberalism and democracy. In this understanding, Hungary and Central Europe more generally stand on the ramparts of Christianity, the antemurale Christianitatis, fighting to save European civilization from both the threats of Islam in the south and of multiculturalism and liberalism from the west. Very similar processes can be seen in Kaczynski's Poland. However, instead of merely downplaying or engaging in practices of active forgetting, the Law and Justice Party instead paints itself as a successor to both the wartime resistance and the underground opposition to communism. As part of its agenda, it has sought to rehabilitate the anti-Soviet partisans who fought against the Stalinist domination of Poland until the mid-1950s. This regime has even set up a new holiday in their honor, despite the fact that many of these fighters were also responsible for atrocities carried out against Belarusians and Jews returning to Poland after the end of the war. As part of this project of presenting a Christian rural vision of the nation as the essential or authentic expression of Polishness, in June 2019, the government chose to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the first visit of the first Polish Pope, Pope John Paul II, to Poland, rather than the 30th anniversary of the Solidarity movement that set off the revolution of 1989. In a particularly brazen attempt to reshape collective remembrance, in 2018, the Polish parliament also passed a memory law that I'm sure you've all heard about, that imposes a jail sentence of up to 3 years on anyone who, quote, accuses publicly and against the facts the Polish nation or the Polish state of being responsible or complicit in the Nazi crimes committed by the German Third Reich, or in any other war crimes, crimes against humanity, or crimes against peace, unquote. In outlawing the use of phrases such as Polish death camps, President Andrzej Duda notes that the bill seeks to ensure both Poland's dignity and historical truth. Much like the measures undertaken by Orban in Hungary, although these moves fetishize the past, it is not the actual past that is fetishized, as historical research has established beyond any doubt that Polish ordinary men played a role in the Holocaust. Although this law has been watered down and has not been fully implemented, the fact that it passed says a lot about how collective memories of communism continue to influence Poland and other Central European nations, and in particular, how central carrier groups, in particular the political class, have sought to weaponize collective memory in these areas. So, these differing understandings of democracy in Europe, based on this bifurcation between 1945 and 1989, on both the nature of democracy, one based on popular sovereignty expressed by majoritarian elections, the other in the protection of basic universal human rights, have really important implications for Europe today. In fact, they have given rise to a number of important policy divergences. While these issues, rooted in disagreements about history and memory, have been percolating ever since the first member states of post-communist Europe acceded to the EU in 2004, they broke into the open most powerfully, I would argue, in 2015, when higher numbers of refugees arriving from the Middle East and Africa began to migrate over the borders of the EU. The states of the West reacted to the largest movement of refugees since the end of World War II differently, at least initially, for the post-communist states of Central Europe. Whereas the former sought to uphold the rights of these refugees to claim asylum, however reluctantly, the latter responded more harshly with a number of policy measures, including the erection of barriers and the criminalization of assistance to migrants, as well as the outright denial of the right to asylum. Although the core EU members of the West were forced to take a harder line in regards to the refugee crisis, following a populist backlash from the far right in 2015, they still have generally defended at least this theoretical right to asylum and sought to find supranational solutions to this crisis through arrangements for refugee resettlement. By contrast, the post-communist states have responded by tightening asylum laws, rejecting resettlement arrangements, erecting fences, and outlawing assistance to refugees, as I mentioned before. Of course, Western Europe's desire to welcome immigrants has been hardly uniform. In particular, German Chancellor Angela Merkel's open door policy has proved quite unpopular in the former German Democratic Republic, the former East Germany. In Germany, in the Federal Republic, or in all of Germany today, the reaction to the post-communist part of the Federal Republic shows that the illiberal rejection of migrants is concentrated within the East German electorate, where many are not at ease with the idea of living in a Western liberal democratic immigrant-based multicultural society. This reaction makes sense, as this section of the German electorate is responding to the lessons of 1989, not 1945. Much like the citizens of East Germany, the post-communist Visegrad group has pushed back against Western attempts to protect asylum rights and to redistribute refugees across the continent. In fact, the EU recently had to abandon an for quotas of asylum seekers due to what Donald Tusk referred to as a split, quote, between East and West, compounded by emotions which make it hard to find common language. Building on the lessons of 1989, representatives from Central Europe have repeatedly rejected Merkel's calls for solidarity, arguing instead that they have a right to make their own decisions in order to protect themselves and their national cultures from external interference. Although the EU is seeking alternative ways of dealing with the crisis, the divisions over the understanding of democracy and of the nation state based on these differing memory cultures that predominate in the West and in the East make it very difficult to see how this can be achieved. From a Western perspective, it's very easy to blame Central Europe for holding on to an outdated, dangerous conception of democracy rooted in nationalism and the nation state. However, while there is much truth to this accusation, such a narrative disrespects the historical experiences and collective memories of post-communist Europe. After all, these experiences do build on resentments that have a real foundation, even if they are then later misused by various political leaders. Despite their feelings of guilt and their desire to integrate Central Europe into the EU, many in the West have found it difficult to understand the experience of communism or to give it any kind of standing vis-a-vis their own memorial frameworks of 1945, which emphasize fascism. As a result, we've seen a lot of attempts by the EU to almost impose the narrative of 1945 onto the new member states as part of a way to sort of produce a unified European understanding of the past. In fact, these divisions broke into the open immediately after the accession, immediately before the accession of the first member state in 2004. In March of that year, at the Leipzig Book Fair, the Latvian politician Sandra Kalniete gave a speech where she argued, quote, that the two totalitarian regimes, Nazism and communism, were equally criminal, unquote. While on its face, this may not seem to be the most controversial statement, it generated a huge backlash as commentators in the western half of the continent accused her of making an illegal comparison, of downgrading the Holocaust, as well as of anti-Semitism. Since 2004, debates over the meaning of the communist past vis-à-vis the legacy of National Socialism have also played themselves out within the institutions of the EU. For example, in 2005, the European Parliament debated a proposal that would have extended the German ban on Nazi symbols like the swastika throughout the EU, arguing that the ban should also include throughout the EU. And this, again, does not seem like it should be something that is very controversial. However, during the debate, the Hungarian MEP József Szájer agreed with the desire to ban the swastika, but argued that if, quote, the Union wishes to propose a ban on the swastika, I suggest adding the symbols of the hated and bloody communist dictatorship as well. No more Nazism in Europe, no more communism in Europe, unquote. Once again, this proposal used a heated response, especially among Western social democrats, who had survived the post-war era by obscuring the differences between communism as a political ideal and communism as it actually existed behind the Iron Curtain. In fact, some Western social democratic parties still use certain symbols that Eastern or Central Europeans like József Szájer would have wanted to ban. After the uproar surrounding the debate on the banning of the swastika, the EP has worked hard to create a consensus surrounding European memory by emphasizing the evils of communism alongside those of Nazism. There have been a number of attempts to do this in a number of conferences hosted by the Parliament, the European Parliament, the presidencies of various member states, as well as within various historical commissions. All of these sort of bring to light the fact that there's a strong feeling in Central Europe that Western member states need to be made more aware of the tragic past of communism. Probably one of the best declarations of this is the 2009 Declaration on European Consciousness and Totalitarianism, which argued that, quote, Europe will not be united unless it is able to form a common view of its history, recognizing Nazism, Stalinism, and fascism and communism as a communist legacy that brings about an honest and thorough debate on their crimes in the past century. Although this sort of division between these memories of Nazism and communism in 1945 and 1989 may start to change as the generations with personal memories of the two world wars, as well as of communism, start to pass away, it is unlikely that Europe will overcome its internal divisions until it is able to develop at least a framework of memory that allows both of these narratives or both of these memory cultures to exist alongside each other. So let me give you a few thoughts in conclusion. My arguments about the importance of collective memory to current European divisions over democracy and of the role of the nation state in contemporary democratic life, which I've only sketched for you today in its broadest outlines, has significant implications for the social sciences more generally, as well as for our understanding of public policy. In regard to the former, my argument suggests that social scientists in general, and political scientists in particular, have to pay more attention to the role that the past plays in how individuals and the communities they form see and understand the present. In particular, we need to develop a greater appreciation for how the past shapes how political views and how politicians and their communities view and understand the material, supposedly objective, military, economic, and demographic factors that are usually form the backbone of social scientific research. In other words, we need to pay more attention to what this hard data means for the individuals and communities involved. This will involve being more aware of of the historical lenses people use to make sense of material factors in the world. Additionally, a greater appreciation for the importance of collective memory in shaping politics in the present also has important implications for public policy, especially for international development and attempts to consolidate democracy around the world. The difficulties the EU has experienced in spreading its understanding of liberal democracy to Central Europe, a region which, despite its differing experiences of the post-war period, still has much in common with the West, puts attempts by the EU writ large to export its political systems globally in a very different light, as well as by such attempts in the West more generally. Most notably, paying attention to the importance of history and memory and the consolidation of democracy might help development agencies to realize that the very term democracy will mean different things to different people because of their different historical backgrounds. These intra-European conflicts over what the role and value of the unstable concept of the nation state is in this process also raise questions about the West's attempt to impose the nation state as a political form, or the state itself even, on other parts of the world. It may well be that the prevalence of so-called failed states in Africa, as well as the difficulties of implanting democracy within them, are not rooted in internal problems within these societies, but in the very attempt to impose the Western structure of the nation state onto societies and communities to which these Western structures are just not suited. Paying more attention to the role that memory cultures play in shaping how individuals and communities interpret and respond to important political ideas, therefore has significant and understudied implications for international development, for our understanding of democracy, and for political science as a whole. So thank you very much, and I would love to take any questions, comments, or thoughts that you might have.